Now, this is not a new article. It's from 2019, but I thought it was very interesting, and I'm going to be going through it in a lot of detail because I presented at RSA today my machine learning thing, and I'm going to have to write a proposal this weekend to submit it at DEF CON, so I'm trying to beef it up. So this is what I have so far, and I've demonstrated quite a bit of this in these classes, but the awareness is the simple stuff here where you just do projects, and then the inner components. So far I've got the part where you learn how to analyze input data in a lot of ways, and where you get to set up a classification model with quite a bit more detail and rate the quality of the model by measuring a lot of statistical parameters to see how good your model is. And then I had the simplest case of the attack here of data poisoning, where you take a model that just sorts written numbers into 0 through 9, and you change some of the ones to label them as 2s, so they're mislabeled to cause it to learn badly. And then you poison the learning set. And the interesting thing there is you really have to poison a lot of the learning set before it has any effect. You have to poison like up to half of it before it really makes a lot more mistakes, which surprised me. But anyway, this stuff is in fact well researched, and that's what this article is. In 2019, he's summarizing these attacks on machine learning. And like I say, I've only managed to write a project that does one of the very simple attacks. But here he talks about what they are. There's a lot of different categories. You can poison it during training with things like poisoning, and you can poison it during production by giving it data to classify after it has learned, which is carefully going to mislead it. And you may remember a few years ago there were like t-shirts and hats you could get with funny squares on it, and they said this will confuse facial recognition systems. So you can add strange things to an image that causes the machine learning model to misunderstand it, and there's a lot of research on that. So here, for example, is a cat, but they modified it so it looks more like a dog. So if you train on images like this, you'll confuse it trying to tell a cat from a dog. That's an obvious one for humans. This is hard for a human to understand, but for machines, you can do, there's a lot of people learning how to do this for machines. You can even do it with things that people won't notice. So like this, you take a panda and you add some noise, but if the noise is not really random, it fools the machine learning. Now it thinks it's a gibbon instead of a panda, and yet to a human it still looks the same. So this is the kind of attack that people have developed many ways to do that, depending on how your machine learning works. And so there's a whole bunch of papers with complicated ways to do that. Then there's privacy attacks. Once your machine has learned, people can go back and give it an image and figure out, it'll categorize it for you. So you can find out somebody's name, things like that. And there's one that someone pointed out to me at RSA. If we mentioned in these natural language models like ChatGPT, they spent $1 million training it on a huge data set, but you can run it on a normal machine once it's there. All you have to have is the parameters. And they say you can take a public thing like ChatGPT-4 and you can learn the parameters by putting up carefully chosen queries. For a thing like an image, for example, you could send an image with just one pixel, and then just the next pixel, and then just the next pixel, and then you could probably solve the equations to figure out what the parameters were. That's another subtle, like leaking of intellectual property. And then there's input in interference, where you try to give it inputs that it will misunderstand. Yeah, this is it. Model extraction, parameter inference. I can determine your parameters by using your machine, and therefore steal your intellectual property. And then there's poisoning is the simple one, where you give it bad input to cause it to learn bad things. And the simple poisoning is what I did, where you just modify misinterpret the data, but there's a lot of subtle ways to poison it and a lot of research papers showing how to do this. And then there's other attacks like backdooring and so on. So I'm going to be going through this and trying to make as many of these attacks work as I can. And I found, by the way, several training courses that are in Jupyter Notebooks already with a lot of these things. So I'm going to find there's a rich category of projects to work from. So I expect I can make a good machine learning workshop out of this. Anyway, so here's a few more. This one I thought is very interesting, and this shows why you need some familiarity with artificial language. You may recall I talked recently about a 60-Minute story. The 60-Minute story, they got the CEO of Google there, and they said, our machine learning model, someone came and asked it questions in an Indian language it had never seen before, and it learned the language and gave sensible answers. And that is completely impossible. It can't do that. Nobody can do that. And they just let that go by. So this shows a fundamental misunderstanding. And here's another one that shows a fundamental misunderstanding. This headline caught my attention. ChatGPT lies in some languages more than others. At first I thought, gee, that's surprising. But that shouldn't be surprising. If that's surprising, you don't understand machine learning. It's very simple. If you ask it a question, what is happening to the Uyghurs in China, in English, you will get an accurate response. There are concentration camps, they're being tortured and murdered. If you ask that question in Chinese, you will get a lie. They're being re-educated, they're getting jobs, they're helping to save them, because AI doesn't understand your question. It's not like a human. It did not understand your question and then translate it to Chinese. It just trained on Chinese media sources. So it just tells you what you will find in the Chinese media sources, which are all government propaganda. And so if you ask the question in Chinese, you'll get the results from the Chinese data. And if you ask the question in English, you'll get the results from the English data. It's not like one of them is more accurate than the other, except on certain topics. One of them will be more accurate. But the model never understood anything you said anyway. It just echoed back the most likely extension of your statement in the language you fed in. So if you think that it would have the same amount of lies in different languages, you're making the anthropomorphic mistake, which is very easy, where you think it's a human. It is not a human. It does not understand your question. It did not think about the answer. It just did pattern matching. It reduced your question down to some numbers, and it used AI to predict what numbers came next. And it can extrapolate. That's all it did. It does not understand what it's doing. It has no idea what the words mean. And it gives the illusion of being a human that understood you, but it doesn't. So anyway, this one I thought is pretty amazing. They've stolen, I didn't know about these websites. There are websites just for people to have sex as they're driving through, City Jerks and Trucker Sucker. And they've been breached and dumped out all their data. So I remember, so these people are probably going to be pretty embarrassed that all this data has been out there. I remember this happened to Ashley Madison about 10 years ago, which is a site specifically for married people to commit adultery. And so anyway, you should probably make a lot of money blackmailing these people. And in fact, when this happened before, a lot of people did take the public data and then blackmail those people. So this guy is the guy that leaked things. Leaked the top secret American data just to impress his friends on Discord, and he's a very scary guy. I heard when they arrested him, they said the FBI was very concerned about arresting him at his home. They had a bunch of agents, they had these elaborate plans, and they managed to catch him walking down the street before he got home. That's because his home was full of guns and bombs. And he had been talking about specific threats. He had been planning to do mass shootings. He'd been researching mass shootings. He'd been collecting guns and bombs. He'd been making racist plans. And he had serious plans to go commit a mass shooting. So this guy was really messed up. He was not a whistleblower like Bradley Manning or the guy that went to Russia. Those guys were like conscientious objectors and wanted to reveal information. This guy was just crazy and dangerous. And now they're having hearings to determine whether they're going to let him out on bail. And I hope they do not let him out on bail. He is obviously a very dangerous guy. And if you let him out, he's very likely to do something horrible. They need to keep this guy locked up.
Do you believe in everything the government says?
Oh, well.
He's just 21 years old.
Yeah, but I don't think this is not coming from the government. This is just coming from journalists. I mean, he posted this stuff online. They went and found his online manifestos. Yeah, he's 21 years old. Yeah. I mean,
He like in the army, like in the Air Force, like 4 years. So he was like joined the Air Force at 18, just out of high school.
Yeah, that's right. He was on an IT team. But anyway, the point is, his social media is not coming from the government. He posted social media with these terrible threats and stuff. So
But if he posts those kind of stuff, then all the governments are monitoring all the Facebook stuff. They
well,
have arrested the guy a long time ago.
yes, they should have. And several of them,
Information come out now.
yes, exactly. And several of them have already been suspended. And there's a big investigation exactly asking this question. Why didn't you detect that this guy was dangerous and crazy before you gave him the clearance? So obviously.
So are you sure you believe everything the government says?
Well.
I wouldn't believe it. I wouldn't trust the government thing.
Well, that's all right. I'm inclined to believe this part, but I guess I'm not like I really know anything. I'm believing what I see in the media. You're right. It could be lied. Anyway, so this is an interesting one in San Francisco. I think it's San Francisco. Yeah, the fire commissioner has been a vigilante attacking homeless people. He's been beating them up and he's been macing them and such. So Yeah, in the Marina District in San Francisco, he'd been hitting homeless people with pepper spray all within areas of his home. He drives them away with pepper spray until one of them finally fought back. So,
He
you know,
didn't show up in court today.
what's that?
He didn't show up.
He didn't show up in court?
Today, so
Oh.
they dropped the case and let the guy go.
Yeah, so now he's fled. Yeah. Well, anyway, it's, you know, the homeless people, are a lot of them in San Francisco, and we're getting more and more crazy responses to them. So this is an interesting article about the Chinese cyber influence operation. You know, the Russians have been doing this for a long time, having bots to try to foment division in America, and apparently the Chinese are getting involved too. At least that's what the Department of Justice says. This does come from the government. But there's a specific attribution to a Chinese agency trying to use social media to guide public opinion in America. And so they talk about it. They're making bots. They're concealing the identities. They're making social media posts and amplifying them and such. And they're trying to spread anti-U.S. claims, which I think is quite consistent with previous information. But this is part of the long process of America and China becoming more and more hostile to each other. I've been watching it go on for like 10 years. And it just seems to be a Cold War getting worse and worse as both sides get more and more angry at each other.
Joe Biden just said that no matter what happened between U.S. and China, the trade will not stop.
Well, I hope not, because I think the trade will help prevent a war. I mean,
Well, that means all the talk about war, it wouldn't affect the trade. It just talk.
well, I hope it's just talk. But you know, because of the supply chain disruption of COVID, Apple has moved. Apple only made 1% of their iPhones in India about 2 years ago, and now they make it 7% of their iPhones in India. They're rapidly moving to India because
They should have, because they
Yeah.
do a lot of sailing here, so they should have a local factories.
Yeah, but there's more and more concern because now we're blocking their access to chips, and they're going to retaliate with boycotts. So the trade is in fact getting messed up. So, and I don't like that because I think the trade is what keeps us from fighting. But anyway, all right, and all right. So I think that's enough of this. I'm going to stop this recording.